2 days. That's all the time Jerry Martin had left before his 4th birthday cake was supposed to be lit with candles that never got lit. 2 days before that birthday, on a warm July afternoon, a small boy was riding a bike outside his home in Manhattan with his 6-year-old brother beside him. By nightfall, he was gone. Not lost. Not wandering off and turning up a few blocks over. Taken, in the plain light of an ordinary afternoon, by a stranger with candy in her outstretched hand and a plan already fully formed in her mind. And here is the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. Jerry Martin did not die that day. He lived. He grew up, grew old, and passed away decades later, having spent every single day of his entire life without knowing his own name. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Cold Case Vault wants to know who's here for this one before we go any further. To understand how something like this could happen and stay buried for nearly 3/4 of a century, you have to understand the world Jerry Martin was born into. Manhattan, in the summer of 1945, was a city exhaling. The war in Europe had just ended. The Nazi surrender that May had sent millions of Americans into the streets in celebration. And now families across the country were counting down the days until husbands, sons, and brothers came sailing home. Rationing was still in effect. Neighborhoods were tight-knit, the kind of tight-knit where everybody assumed they knew everybody else's business. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place where nobody thought twice about a friendly woman offering candy to 2 little boys on a sidewalk. Jerry Martin had been born on the 11th of July, 1941. He was 2 days from turning 4 when his world ended. His older brother, Tom, just 6 years old himself, was with him that afternoon, the two of them out on their bikes near home, doing exactly what little boys did in New York City in 1945, running loose in the neighborhood unbothered and free. A woman approached them. She was warm, unthreatening. She had candy, and she offered it to both boys. Tom hesitated. Something about her didn't sit right with him, or maybe he simply wasn't hungry. He said no. Jerry, not yet 4 and with no reason in the world to distrust a stranger's kindness, said yes. The woman took his hand. She told Tom not to worry, that they would be right back. They were never right back. As the afternoon stretched into evening, and evening bled into night, Tom Martin stood on that sidewalk or ran home or waited, or did whatever a terrified 6-year-old does when he begins to understand that the world has gone horribly wrong. And Jerry did not come back. He never came back. The Martin family was already fragile before that afternoon. Jerry's parents, Harold and Nancy, had separated by the time of the kidnapping, and in the aftermath, the kind of terrible suspicion that tends to descend on broken families in moments of tragedy took hold. Investigators wondered whether one parent had taken the boy as a result of the split. Harold had remarried and had a 1-year-old daughter. On paper, the circumstances looked complicated. Nancy insisted she had nothing to do with it, and her family stood behind her completely, but the suspicion muddied the investigation and pulled attention inward, away from where the real answers actually lived. There was no national registry for missing children in 1945. No coordinated search network. No DNA testing. Barely a framework for understanding what had even happened, let alone how to find a child taken by a stranger in a city of millions. The law that finally created a national missing children registry wasn't passed until 1983, nearly 4 decades after Jerry vanished. Before that, in the first half of the 20th century, the kidnapping of young children, particularly toddlers, was tragically common, often carried out by women who felt unbearable pressure to produce a child and simply absorb someone else's into their own lives. Harold Martin died without ever learning what happened to his youngest son. Nancy died the same way. Tom did not. There are people in this world defined by what they've lost, not in a broken way, but in the way of someone who refuses to let the loss be the end of the story. Tom Martin was that person. He carried his brother with him for his entire life. The memory of that summer afternoon, the candy, the woman, the hand that reached out and took Jerry while Tom stood there, too young and too small to do anything to stop it. Imagine being 6 years old and watching your little brother disappear. Imagine carrying that through your entire childhood, your adolescence, your adult years, your retirement, always wondering whether Jerry was alive somewhere, whether he was happy, whether he ever thought about the family he came from. Tom never stopped wondering. When at-home DNA testing became available to the public in the early 2000s, He submitted a sample without hesitation. He didn't know who he was waiting for, or if anyone would ever appear. He left his genetic fingerprint in that system like a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean, with nothing but hope that someone, somewhere, would eventually find it. He was 79 years old and living in Florida when the bottle finally washed ashore. In 2017, a 51-year-old woman named Audrey Bell, living on Long Island, bought a DNA testing kit for a reason that had nothing to do with kidnapping or cold cases. She was the mother of triplets and simply wanted to know which of her children were identical and which was fraternal. Audrey had grown up in a proud Italian-American family. Her father, Richard, had always spoken with deep pride about his heritage. The food, the culture, the roots, all of it central to who they were. Audrey had never once questioned it. The results said she had 0 Italian ancestry. Not a trace. Instead, the test showed Irish, Scottish, and Spanish origins, the kind of result that makes you stare at the screen convinced there's been some mistake. Her parents chalked it up to a glitch and moved on. But the question never fully went away. 2 years later, Audrey's twin sister Cynthia took her own test. So did their younger sister, Stephanie. Both came back with the same result. No Italian ancestry. None. Now 3 daughters had results that directly contradicted everything they'd ever been told about who they were. By this point their father had already passed away, so they turned to a cousin who shared his name and had known the family his whole life. What he told them stopped them cold. When the sisters examined their DNA matches, they were connected to each other, but to almost no one else in the family they'd grown up in. The genetic links simply weren't there. And then Cynthia, who had opted into relative matching, saw an unfamiliar name light up in her results. Tom Martin, sharing enough DNA to suggest an uncle or a grandfather. 79 years old. Retired. Living in Florida. A man who had put his DNA into a database decades earlier, hoping for exactly this kind of miracle. If you're still with me at this point, drop a comment below with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly locked into this one, because it only gets stranger from here. Cynthia and Audrey reached out to Tom, and what he told them when they finally connected shook them to their core. He told them about a summer day in July of 1945, about bikes and candy and a woman who came out of nowhere, about the little brother he had never stopped looking for, 2 days from his 4th birthday when he was taken. The sisters did the math as Tom spoke. Their father's birth certificate listed his birth date as the 31st of May, 1943. But if Jerry Martin had been nearly 4 when he vanished in July of 1945, his real birth date fell somewhere around July of 1941, not 1943. The woman listed on the birth certificate as his mother, Isabel, had been in her 40s when he supposedly appeared. She and her husband Angelo had no children together. She had 2 daughters from an earlier relationship, but they were already grown women. What the sisters pieced together and what the DNA supported was this. Isabel, desperate to present Angelo with a son before his return from the war, had seen an opportunity on a Manhattan sidewalk and taken it. She lured Jerry away from his brother. She brought him home. She renamed him. And then she did something particularly calculated and cruel. She told him he was only 2 years old, not 4, and altered a birth certificate to make it official. By stripping 2 years off his age, she made it nearly impossible for anyone to recognize him as the missing 4-year-old from the papers. He had a new name, a new birthday, a new family, and no way to know any different because he wasn't even 4 years old yet, and a child that age simply does not have the cognitive scaffolding to hold on to who he was while an adult is actively dismantling it. This wasn't a moment of panic. This was premeditated. And for 74 years, it worked. What the DNA revealed was devastating, not just in what it solved, but in what it illuminated about the life their father had actually lived. Jerry Martin, though he never knew it, grew up in a household where something was always wrong and nobody would say what it was. Isabel treated him like an outsider. He was hushed at the dinner table, kept at arm's length, made to feel from his earliest memories that he did not fully belong because he didn't. The cousin later confirmed something staggering. Their father appeared to be the only person in the extended family who did not know the truth. Everyone else seemed to know or know enough to stay quiet. He grew into an adult carrying deep anxiety and bipolar disorder, conditions his daughters now understand in an entirely different light. When Angelo died, their father was only 26, and whatever fragile connection remained to that family unraveled completely. Nobody reached out. Nobody tried. He built a life of his own. Apart from all of it, never once told who he truly was. And by every account, he built a good one. His daughters remember him as warm, funny, full of spirit. A man with a quick laugh and a playful soul despite the weight he carried without ever understanding its source. He loved coconut cake. He loved movies. He had a passion for acting that surfaced in old headshots his daughters found after his death. He let the people closest to him in completely, even while carrying a low, nameless hum of not belonging that never fully left him. When Cynthia and Audrey flew to Florida in 2019 to meet Tom, they brought photographs of their father. Tom looked at them and saw his brother. Not a vague resemblance. The kind that hits you in the chest before your brain finishes processing what your eyes are seeing. And then there were the other things. The love of movies and acting. The coconut cake. The particular way their father had carried himself. Small, specific details that had somehow survived 74 years and an entirely fabricated identity, echoing straight back to a little boy Tom remembered from one afternoon in 1945. The DNA had already answered the question, but standing in that room, looking at those photographs, hearing those stories, that was proof of a different kind, the kind you feel rather than measure. Jerry Martin had died before any of this came to light. He passed away in 2017, the very same year Audrey first took the test that would eventually unravel everything. He went to his grave under a name that wasn't his, a birthday that wasn't his, and not a single memory of the brother who had spent 74 years refusing to stop looking for him. If there is a cruelty sitting at the center of this story, it is that 74 years of searching, and the answer arrived a breath too late. But what the DNA gave Tom, and what the daughters gave him by finding him, by choosing to know the truth even when it was painful, was something real. It was not the reunion he had spent a lifetime imagining. It was not sitting across a table from his little brother finally saying, "I looked for you, I never stopped." But it was the knowledge that Jerry had lived, that he had been loved, that he had daughters who adored him, and a life that had been full, despite everything that had been taken from him before he was even old enough to remember it happening. There are people who will watch this and ask how. How does a child get taken in broad daylight on a city street and nobody finds him? How does a woman walk away with someone else's son and build an entire false life around him? And nobody asks the right questions. The answer, as painful as it is this: because in 1945 the systems designed to protect children simply did not exist. There was no national registry, no coordinated search network, no DNA database, not even a framework for understanding stranger abduction as a crime that required a structured response. Even a birth certificate, that most basic document of identity, was vulnerable to anyone with access and intent. This is not ancient history. The law that finally built a national missing children registry wasn't passed until 1983. Before that, if a case went cold, there was nowhere left for a family to turn. Just grief, and a world that quietly expected you to move on from it eventually. We have come further since then. We have alert systems, national databases, DNA technology that can reach across 74 years and two entirely different identities. But we are not where we need to be. Children still go missing. Families still spend decades not knowing. Cases still go cold. This is why this channel exists, not to dwell in despair, but to bear witness, to say the names, to keep asking how we do better. Jerry Martin deserved better. Tom Martin deserved better. And every other family living inside that same unbearable silence deserves better too. If the story moved you the way it moved me, hit like, drop a subscribe, and stay close. Cold Case Vault will keep finding the names the world almost let go of.